Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So today, being the Uposatha day, we've taken the 8 precepts, and hopefully you'll also be staying for meditation. And I think it's important to constantly come back to the underlying principles of Buddhism. So what exactly is it that we're trying to do? And how is it that we're going about trying to do it? So remembering that Buddhism is fundamentally, it's the practice of becoming fully awakened. So it's the ism of Buddha. So Buddha means awakened one. So Buddhism is the practice of becoming awakened, of becoming just like the Buddha. So this actually it's already a very important statement because it's pointing to the fact that every single one of us, without exception, has exactly the same fundamental nature as a fully awakened being. So there's nothing uniquely, specially unenlightened about you. So you are not unique in being the only person in the universe that can't become awakened. The path is not especially difficult only for you, nor is the path especially easy only for you. But actually for everyone it's really, really hard. And for everyone it takes a really, really long time. But the important point is that for everyone, it's completely possible. So every single one of us can become fully awakened, exactly the same as the Buddha. And in fact, it's also important to remember that at one point, the Buddha was just like us. So the Buddha wasn't always the Buddha. In fact, we have hundreds of stories of past lives of the Buddha, which recount an ordinary unawakened being, not really much different from all of us. And this ordinary unawakened being doing various ordinary unenlightened things, but also working on building up certain spiritual qualities, which eventually culminated in becoming fully awakened. But the real important point of these stories, in my mind, is that it's pointing out the fact that the Buddha was originally exactly like us. So whatever difficulties you're having, whatever challenges you have in training your mind, well, the Buddha went through exactly the same thing. And look how he turned out. So that means you can turn out just like the Buddha. That make you happy? I saw a smile on your face when I said you can turn out just like the Buddha. Yeah.
I was just imagining actually you.
Someday, I hope. But actually, I think you. I can actually see it where you're sitting. So again, the point being is that this is not something separate from ourselves. So of course we have infinite respect for the Buddha, but it's important not to other the Buddha. It's not to treat the Buddha as something completely different from ourselves and separate from ourselves, but rather recognizing that Buddhahood, so the state of being fully awakened, Buddhahood, is something which is accessible to every single sentient being, including every person sitting in this room, including the cat, though usually not in the body of a cat. Usually they need to be reborn as a human or something higher first. But even the insects, so there might be some ants in the corners or fly on the wall or something, they also have exactly the same nature as a Buddha, exactly the same ability to become fully awakened. And so Buddhism is the practice of becoming the Buddha, becoming fully awakened. And of course, it also follows that there's not one Buddha, but there have been countless Buddhas throughout the past, present, and future. So Buddha is a state of being. It's a station. It's a state which anyone can reach and inhabit, and which countless people have reached in the past, and countless people will reach in the future, and which hopefully all of us are working on moving towards now. And we're particularly fortunate in that we're at a time and place in history where we still have access to fairly detailed accounts of the teachings of a Buddha relatively recently. So we had a Buddha in this world a little over 2,500 years ago, which might seem like a long time, but actually in terms of Buddhist timescales, that's a finger snap. It's nothing. So 2,000 years is nothing. It's a blink of an eye. It's not even that. So when in Buddhist timescales, we sometimes talk in terms of a kalpa. So kalpa is, you might translate it as eon. But one kalpa is the lifespan of a universe. And I actually don't know what astrophysics is saying these days, but they used to estimate it was around 200 billion years or something, like the basic estimate for the lifespan of a universe from beginning to end. But that might be out of date. They might have a different number these days. Probably significantly bigger, actually. That seems a little bit short now that I think about it. Anyway, so a kalpa is a really, really, really long time. So the lifespan of a universe from Big Bang until Big Crunch. Are they still talking about Big Crunch? Is anyone up to date on astrophysics?
That is still a possibility, I think.
Yeah.
I heard there's heat death.
Possibility, heat death, that's the other possibility. Anyway, however the universe ends, whether it is in heat death or Big Crunch, point is, from beginning to end, we're talking hundreds of billions of years. That's one kalpa. And in some sutras, the Buddha talks about tens of thousands of kalpas. And actually, the Buddha also says that there's no discoverable beginning. No matter how far back you look in time, you can't find a starting point. You just keep seeing more stuff before that. What we're, again, we're not actually particularly concerned with how long things take. We're not particularly concerned with how much time we have left to practice before attaining awakening. But what we're concerned with, and we're also not particularly concerned with how long it's been since Shakyamuni Buddha was alive, because again, 2,000 years, snap of a finger. 2,000 years versus 200 billion years, snap of a finger. And even one kalpa is not particularly long in the Buddhist way of thinking. So the Brahma beings, their minimum lifespan is one kalpa. So for them, one kalpa is like 100 years. It's not a particularly long amount of time. So again, we had a Buddha very, very recently. We still have pretty good records of their teachings. You can see these red books here is Pali Canon and Pali. Also, some of those are English translations. No, these are the English translations. Over here is it in Pali. Also a tiny selection from the Mahayana canon. So just a little glimpse here of some of the records that we have of the Buddha's teachings. And as you read through these teachings, you'll find that the majority of it is actually very practical, down-to-earth, straightforward instructions. So people sometimes talk about Buddhism as being a philosophy. And I don't know about you, but when I think about philosophy, I think of these mind-numbingly boring things that I studied for a short period of time in college, of like people hypothesizing endlessly about weird ideas and like writing books and books and books about like random conceptualizing and proliferating all kinds of complex ideas which had no foundation in reality. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about Buddhism. So the Buddha was very straightforward. He was like, okay, look at your mind. Is there any discomfort or unease or displeasure or dissatisfaction or discontent in your mind? Any at all? Audience participation time. Look at your mind. Is there any discomfort or discontent or dissatisfaction in the mind? Anyone who didn't raise your hands, I'm assuming you're spacing out rather than listening. So busted. So this is actually the beginning of Buddhism. The beginning of Buddhism is this honest self-examination and being willing to actually face up to the facts that we're not 100% happy 100% of the time. In fact, usually those percentages are quite a bit lower than that. I'm not going to take a stab at the percentages because it's beside the point. The point is that it's less than 100%. So it's looking at the mind. It's like, am I experiencing any discomfort or unease or dissatisfaction at all? Well, this is the First Noble Truth. This is the basis of the teaching that is special to Buddhas, that's unique to the Buddhas. It's acknowledging our own experience of unease, of discontent. And this is necessary because we need to face the way things are if we want to make changes, if we want to make improvements. For example, after lunch, I imagine there was a big pile of dirty dishes. So if you just walk in there and you just pretend that the dishes are clean, does that achieve anything useful? You just store the dishes as though they were clean. Is that helpful? Not really. No, the first thing is you have to acknowledge, okay, these pots and pans and bowls and plates and cups, these are dirty. And that means we need to clean them. So similarly, the first thing is acknowledging our mind. It's acknowledging that our mind is experiencing discomfort and unease, discontent, displeasure. So then we need to figure out what's causing it. Why is this happening to us? Whose fault is it? Who can we blame for this? Of course, the Buddha is, being the Buddha, he already has the answers for us, but we're expected to reconfirm these for ourselves. So it's not enough just to believe what the Buddha said. We're expected to actually examine our own experience and see for ourselves whether or not the Buddha was right. Spoiler warning, he was right. But figure it out for yourself. So we look at our mind. Well, what's causing all of this discomfort and unease? And the Buddha said, invariably, it's some form of desire, without exception. It's always based upon some kind of desire. So for example, right now, maybe you're feeling bored and agitated. Well, why? Why? Then you start looking at the mind. It's like, well, what's causing this? And you're like, oh, it's because I want to do something different. I want to go to my car and listen to music. I want to go home and watch TV. I want to go have a snack. I want to fill in the blank. Or sometimes it's more simple. You're having some pain in the body and you want the pain to go away. So it's, I want this sensation to end. Or I want these sensations to change. So again, it comes down to a very basic thing. There's some kind of wanting. Or maybe somebody was a little bit insensitive. They said something that wasn't particularly thoughtful or considerate, or hurt your feelings a little bit, or made you feel excluded. And well, so once again, why is that a problem? Because we wanted it to be different. We wanted the person to be kind and thoughtful. So this is not excusing their behavior. Of course, we do make a conscious effort to try to be kind and thoughtful with our speech. But why is it that we get upset when other people are not kind and thoughtful? Because we want them to be different. We want them to act differently. So why are we experiencing discomfort and unease? Because we want it to be different. So there's a few interesting stories in the suttas of people coming to the Buddha and speaking to the Buddha very rudely, very harshly. And the Buddha being completely unbothered. Because why would he be bothered? It's just that person's just expressing their own defilements. Why would the Buddha be bothered by that? He's not going to make himself unhappy just because somebody else has a stained mind. That's their problem. So there's a lovely story of someone came to the Buddha and started hurling insults at the Buddha. And the Buddha just waited patiently until the person was done talking. And then the Buddha said, so do people ever bring you gifts? And the person was like, of course, people bring me gifts all the time. So this was a wealthy and well-known person. So he's like, of course, people bring me gifts all the time. And the Buddha said, so what happens if you don't want those gifts? And then the person says, well, then I don't receive them. And the person brings it home with them and keeps it for themselves. And the Buddha says, well, today you brought me insults and I'm not receiving them, so you get to keep them for yourself. So it's the same. It's like, what are we doing when we encounter rude or unsettling behavior from other people? Are we taking it inside ourselves and disturbing our own peace of mind? Or do we just let them keep their own disturbance? Like, we don't need to make ourselves disturbed just because we encounter somebody else who has a behavior problem. Of course, if we are in a role where we can gently point out to someone that their behavior is unwholesome or inappropriate or not sufficiently thoughtful, then out of kindness for that person, we might try to help them improve their conduct. But much of the time, we just let them be who they are and do what they do, and we focus on maintaining our own peace of mind, our own purity of mind. So again, we examine any experience of unease or discomfort, and we invariably see there's some desire at its root, some kind of attachment or obsession or aversion at its root. And similarly, we notice that when the mind is free of desire, free of aversion, then the mind is happy, it's calm, it's peaceful, it's joyful, can even be stunningly blissful when the mind is free of desire, even just for a few moments, when we put down our wanting for just a few moments. So earlier I was talking to someone, and they mentioned how when they get what they want, then they're happy for a few moments, but it doesn't last long because then they start wanting something else. It's like, well, why are we happy for those few moments? When we get what we want, why are we happy for a few moments? Because for a few moments, we stopped wanting anything. So you really want this bell, and then you get the bell, and just for a moment, you stop wanting anything. You can no longer want the bell because now you have it. But then within a very short period of time, usually a few fractions of a second, then our habit of wanting things all the time kicks in and we start wanting something else. Or actually, sometimes we just want to keep what we got. Like, we get something and we're like, yay, I got what we want. And then we're like, and I want to keep it forever. And so then the mind immediately switches from this temporary contentment right into this painful clinging, this painful grasping and attachment mode. Or we want more. We're like, okay, nice bell. Actually, it's not the best. The sound is just slightly off. Not horrible. I need a new one. And so very quickly, the mind just starts generating new desires. Actually, I like this bell partly because it actually is slightly discordant. It's like not so discordant that it makes you cringe when you ring it. But if you listen closely, it's almost like there's two different bells ringing at the same time. It's just slightly disharmonious. I actually really like this bell for exactly that reason. It's a constant reminder of dukkha. Because actually most of our dukkha is not that like overpowering anguish. So when we hear the word suffering, we think of like anguish and misery. But actually that's not most of our dukkha. Most of our dukkha is that like, it's just not quite perfect. Like that's actually the majority of our dukkha. Sound familiar? I see some knowing smiling and nodding. Yeah. So God, we're so petty. This is actually what really blows my mind whenever I practice Buddhism, which has been 20 years now, which is just how stunningly petty I am. I just get so worked up about the most insignificant things. And so we start looking at our dukkha and we realize how silly most of our dukkha is. And it's also totally unnecessary. Like, this is a perfectly fine bell. It serves its function perfectly well. What's the point in suffering because it's not absolutely perfect? Or maybe you had lunch and you were like, okay, it was pretty good, but it could have been better. Well, why don't you just appreciate the fact that you had lunch? Like, why does the mind have to start going into like, well, I want this or I want that? Why can't we just accept that things are exactly the way they are? Why do we always try to make a mess out of a perfectly peaceful mind? And so the Buddha is pointing out to the fact that it's actually totally unnecessary. Dukkha is always unnecessary. It's always an unnecessary extra topping of feces that we put on top of everything. So you had your lunch, and rather than just have your lunch, you put a big pile of feces on top of it, which is this constant desire and attachment. Like, well, I want more cake. And actually the cake wasn't that great. I want a better cake. And I really liked that, but it was too spicy or not spicy enough. And why was all that taken when I didn't get any? And so the mind just keeps like sprinkling more and more feces on our experience, and it's doing this constantly. We're just constantly ruining our happiness in every moment. And it's this, and what we're doing is we're just constantly sprinkling desire, aversion, and attachment onto our experience. Yeah.
I have a quick story I think a lot of people can relate to. Getting your morning coffee, sometimes like going out to get coffee, and then in the event that it's not made correctly, I've been observing my mind, and I get so worked up on it. I'm like, why am I so upset about this? There's bigger problems, or there's bigger things to worry about. But lately I've been trying to tell myself it's okay if it's messed up, just drink it. But I think that's very true. Just the silliest things that we kind of fuss over.
Yeah, actually, I remember I was a few months ago. I was giving a talk in Italy, and actually I gave an example just like this. And I talked about. I made a comment. I was talking about pizza instead of about coffee, and I was like, I know it's a silly example, and this person in the front row was like, "That's not a silly example." And because actually this is the truth, it's exactly like you're saying. These actually are really silly things, but they don't feel silly to us. Like somebody screws up your coffee and you're just like, how dare they? My day is ruined. Yeah, your day is ruined because you just ruined it for yourself.
Yeah.
It's not the barista that ruined your day, it was you. It was you getting so obsessed about a cup of coffee. That's what made your day a bad day. So thank you for that example. That's actually a great demonstration of how we constantly ruin our own day. And then we blame other people.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's somebody else's fault. Why our life is less than perfect. But actually, one of the basic principles that the Buddha is constantly pointing to is that our happiness is not the responsibility of anybody else. It's our own. And at first glance, that's actually a little bit disappointing. It's like, oh, I don't get to blame anyone. There's no scapegoat. I actually have to take responsibility for my own happiness and peace of mind. It's actually a little bit disappointing. It's like, oh, it's not my mom's fault. I thought my mom screwed up my upbringing. That's why I have a terrible life. It's not my boyfriend's fault, but he was so rude to me yesterday. Of course it's his fault. It's not my barista's fault. He got my coffee wrong 3 days in a row. So it's my own fault? It's a little bit disturbing at first. It's like, wait, isn't this victim blaming? And it's like, well, but on the other hand, the Buddha is pointing to something much more important, which is that we can choose to be happy. If our happiness is dependent upon other people, then we have no control over it. If your barista actually can make you unhappy, wow, that's horrible. But actually, no, they can't even make you temporarily unhappy. Only you can do that.
That's true.
You might consider going to a different coffee place or making your own coffee. Yeah, it's hard to get a good cup of coffee. I agree. It's really difficult. So at some point, you just have to accept that this is the nature of coffee. It's inherently unsatisfying. And if we're constantly seeking satisfaction in coffee, then we're going to be disappointed quite a fair percentage of the time. And so, again, the Buddha is pointing to the fact that when we put down our desire and aversion, and we're completely present with the experience exactly as it is, we don't add to it wanting or rejecting, we don't add to it liking and disliking, then that experience is perfect exactly as it is. There's actually nothing wrong there at all. There's nothing wrong here at all. And there's only a problem when we make a problem out of a situation. So the situation itself is not a problem. But when we make it a problem, then we experience dukkha. We experience what we call suffering or discontent, dissatisfaction. And so again, it's easy to say these things, but then we start looking at our life and we realize that we're actually doing this all the time. We're constantly generating our own discontent, our own unhappiness, our own confusion. And so the Buddha, fortunately, gives much more detailed instructions for how we can go about observing the mind and retraining the mind. And broadly speaking, we divide this up into 3 major trainings. So the training of sila, which is wholesome conduct, wholesome habits of body and speech. Samadhi, which is the unification and stilling of the mind, which we mostly do through meditation practice. So learning how to make the mind steady and focused and still. And the training of panya, which is wisdom or discernment or discrimination, in the sense of the ability to clearly understand whatever experience is happening. And so the practice of sila, so again, I mentioned at the very, very beginning, I mentioned the 5 precepts, and this is kind of the basic foundation of sila. If you're not at least following the 5 precepts, or at least trying to follow at least 3 or 4 of the 5 precepts, then you've got a long way to go towards perfecting sila. So again, trying to at least follow 3 or 4 of the 5 precepts is a big step in the right direction. But if you look at these 5 precepts, they all have a single underlying principle, which is not causing harm. So this is the essence of sila, the essence of wholesome habits. It's not hurting anyone, not harming anyone. So why is it that we don't kill, we don't steal, we don't sexually abuse people? Why is it that we don't tell lies? Why is it that we don't use alcohol? Because we don't want to hurt anyone. We don't want to cause harm to anyone, whether others or towards ourselves. And instead, we want to bring benefit. So actually, the basic motivation of Buddhist practice is the wish, the wish to be happy, the wish to be free of suffering. So the basic motivation of Buddhist practice is, even if it's only ourselves that we want to be happy, that's at least one person. We have compassion for at least one person. And actually, eventually, we start to realize that self-centeredness is one of the things that's preventing us from being happy. So then eventually, our self-compassion naturally expands into universal compassion. But it's this basic motivation of recognizing our own unhappiness and wanting this being to be free of misery, free of suffering, wanting this being to be truly happy. So practicing sila, it's looking at our conduct, looking at what we do with our body, what we do with our speech, and trying to avoid causing harm to anyone. So whether physical harm or emotional harm, we try to not cause harm. And instead, we try to bring benefit. So another element of sila is the practice of generosity. So always seeing, what can I do for the benefit of others? What can I do that will bring more happiness to the people affected by me? The practice of samadhi. So in a few minutes, wow, I've been talking for a long time. In a few minutes, we'll do some meditation practice. So samadhi, the word samadhi literally means holding together or bringing together. So samadhi practice is the practice of unifying and stabilizing the mind. So usually by focusing the mind on a particular part of our experience, then the mind starts to drop all of its other activities. And the mind becomes increasingly steady and focused and still. And samadhi is actually a very simple practice to explain, but in practice it's very difficult to do because, again, our mind has very strong habits. So trying to retrain the mind it's a bit like trying to train a cat or a dog or a small child. It takes a lot of time and effort and persistence. Actually, it's easier to train a cat than to practice samadhi. But it's worth the effort, because the Buddha says when the mind is well concentrated, then it can see things as they really are. Samahitang chittang yatabhutang jnanadasanang. When the mind is in samadhi, it can know and see things as they actually are. So this is the point of practicing samadhi, is that it enables the mind to have the razor sharp precision, this laser pointed focus, this detailed knowing of itself, detailed knowing of one's own mind, so that we can clearly see the true nature of our experience. And the Buddha said that what we recognize when we look at our experience was we recognize that absolutely everything in our experience, without exception, absolutely everything is impermanent. Everything is constantly changing. Nothing is the same for even 2 consecutive moments. every single thing in our body changes every single moment. In fact, there's not even a body. We can't even talk about a persistent existence of a body. What we can talk about is physical sensations that appear and vanish in every moment, which we misperceive as an ongoing persistent body. But actually, there's just sensations appearing and disappearing. That's it. And we create the concept of body and we pretend that it's real. But actually, it's not real at all. It's just a concept. It's just an idea. The actual experience is sensations appearing and disappearing every moment. And it's the misconception of it as an ongoing body that generates so much dukkha, generates so much discontent and dissatisfaction. And the Buddha also said that as we observe our experience, then we'll start to recognize that every part of our experience is an impersonal expression of cause and effect. So it's an impersonal manifestation of the laws of nature. So once again, looking at this body, why does your body feel the way it does? Like maybe right now your mind is a bit sluggish and foggy and your stomach hurts a little bit. Why is that? Well, you probably ate too much. It's cause and effect. Or maybe you ate things that weren't particularly healthy. You skipped the salad and just took a bowl full of cake instead. Might have seemed like a good idea at the time, but now seems like maybe that wasn't the greatest idea. So this is causality. So that feeling of discomfort in the stomach, of discomfort in the mind, is that who you really are? Is that the essence of what it means to be you? Or is that just a temporary experience created by particular causes and conditions? And so the Buddha says when we analyze every part of our experience, then inevitably we come to see that there is nothing anywhere in our experience which is ultimately the definition of who we are. So the ideas in our mind, well, those are all temporary. They're all subject to change. You have different ideas now than you did 10 or 20 years ago. Some of you weren't even alive 20 years ago. So you might, well, not in this life, you had maybe some other body and mind somewhere else. So clearly, whatever ideas you had 20 years ago weren't you. Your preferences might be different now than they were 10 or 20 years ago. Your opinions, your beliefs might be different now than then. So clearly, that's not you. It's just a temporary condition, temporary experience. So when we start to examine everything in our experience in this way, then we also recognize that clinging to something which is temporary and impermanent and impersonal causes suffering. Not clinging to things that are temporary and impersonal means no suffering. And turns out everything is temporary and impersonal. So what's the point in trying to hold on to anything? Desiring things that are impermanent and impersonal causes suffering. Not desiring things that are impermanent and impersonal does not cause suffering. Again, it's actually stuff which makes a lot of sense when we think about it. And yet, for some reason, moment after moment after moment, we keep making the wrong choices. We're like, oh, yes, identifying as the body is dukkha. Yep, the Buddha's right. And this is my body. This is who I am. Like, we just keep doing this moment after moment. We're like, yes, everything is not self except for this. Of course, this is me. These thoughts, these memories, these ideas are me. My preferences, my ideas. How dare you insult me? Of course, we fall right back into this so quickly and easily. Which is why we have to constantly practice. We have to constantly train the mind. It doesn't happen quickly or easily. So that's a brief summary of what we're trying to do here. At this time, I think we can go ahead and end the talk and do some meditation practice.
Dhammayang Dhammakataya Sarukarang Dadamase
Sadhu.